what happened is that there was this community of individuals who happened to be parrots. And I
Right.
got to know them, and they were my friends, and I loved them.
Welcome to another episode of Gentle Finds Podcast. Today, I'm very happy to introduce you to Mark Bittner, who is the author of the book The Wild Parrots of Telegraph Hill, A Love Story. The book recounts the true story of his life in San Francisco, where he started his life as a Dharma bum and became one of San Francisco's famed neighborhood characters. While living on Telegraph Hill, he discovered a flock of wild parrots living outside his apartment and developed a remarkable relationship with the birds. He became known as Parrot Man, and his heartwarming story of his friendship with the birds is even told through the wonderful award-winning documentary of the same name, The Wild Parrots of Telegraph Hill. Hi, Mark.
Hi, how are you?
Good. So I remember seeing the movie The Wild Parrots of Telegraph Hill in the theaters in Berkeley years ago. I don't know what year it was exactly.
Around 2005 or so.
Okay. And I was so touched by your story. I remember I kept wanting to run into you somewhere in San Francisco and having ghost sightings of you, sure that I'd seen you. And I was recommending your movie to taxi cab drivers, honestly. But I think I was just so touched by your relationship with the animals, and I really felt like I could relate to how you were drawn to them and kind of the rhythm at which you developed your relationship with them. So do you want to tell us a little bit about how you got there, or?
Sure.
Okay.
I'd been wanting to have a, quote, nature experience. I was sick
Yeah.
of cities.
Yeah.
And then I read something by Gary Snyder, which convinced me that if I was serious, if I was sincere about wanting to have a nature experience, I would start right where I was. I didn't have to leave a city because nature is everywhere. And I didn't like that. I wanted to hear that I should get out of the city. I was trying to find a motivation to do that. And so I started looking at birds because that was, the most natural thing around. And I wanted to have an experience with a critter, I guess.
Yeah.
And then I started seeing these parrots, and that just shocked me. What are parrots doing here in San Francisco? I had never heard of that phenomenon. It's actually quite common all around the world right now because of the
we have some in Paris. Yeah.
Probably rose-ringed parakeets. That's the most common species in Europe. But so I see these parrots, and I was over on Russian Hill actually when I saw them, and I was just blown away. I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then I started seeing them where I was living here on Telegraph Hill. And it was very strange because I was fascinated by them, and somehow fate just led me to their doorstep, or it led them to mine, because I'd started feeding the native birds, the wild birds, and it attracted the parrots. And I just slowly got closer, very slowly. It took me 6 months to feed the first bird by hand.
Yeah.
It took a long time, but they trusted me. I had to earn their trust.
Mm-hmm. And before you ended up on Telegraph Hill, you actually were living on the streets for a bit.
Yeah, I was. Part of it was actually literally on the street, but mostly I was just, crashing in any little nook or cranny that I could gain access to and not be in trouble for doing so. I was essentially homeless, but not in a sleeping in doorways kind of way. That did happen to me, but for about a month and a half, 2 months. So then I got a caretaking job on the other side of Telegraph Hill from where I've been staying, North Beach. And then the woman whose estate I was helping take care of, she died, and I took over the house actually for a while. And that's when I started encountering the parrots.
And you were on what seemed like a bit of a quest when you arrived there.
Well, I still am. In fact, to me, the most interesting thing is when I was feeding the parrots, I always felt like I was intended to do it, that it was supposed to happen. And I'm utterly convinced of that now. They were part of a story that I'd started when I was 14 years old, as far as I'm concerned. And
How
one
so?
of the issue for me always was just the fact of consciousness, the fact that we can, you know, speak and think and see and all of this. And well, what is it? You know, what is a personality?
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought of it in terms of human beings. And I never considered it at a broader level. And so dealing with the parrots, I had to start thinking about consciousness in a broader sense. What is it?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of stuff that I'd been reading and not understanding suddenly became clear once I started getting involved with parrots. Because you see, you know, personality is not something confined to human beings. A lot
Right.
of people look at animals as these little genetic robots, and they're not
Yeah.
that at all. They have a sense of humor, they have jealousy, they have all kinds of, they have curiosity, they have all kinds of things. And you can see, I mean, it's kind of a universal thing because you can read what they're experiencing at that moment. It's not like I don't speak, you know, mind. Birds have their mind, and you can, and it's a universal thing. You can see when a bird is curious or when it's angry or whatever. It's in their eyes.
Mm-hmm.
So that broadened my whole understanding of what I'd been looking at for decades and not understanding quite sufficiently.
Yeah, you mention at the end of the book, because it's both a book and a movie, and at the end of the book you go back into your feelings about consciousness, and
Yeah,
you talk about how a lot of people see animals as chemical robots,
right.
right? And you so experience something much more profound than that, which I think so many of us can relate to. And I think part of that came from, like I said, the rhythm at which you sort of approached it. You were able to take the time to really be with them at their rhythm.
Yeah.
And so many of us are going about our days so quickly that I think we actually just don't see and observe what they're willingly they're showing us. And it really changed your life.
I wouldn't say it changed my life, but
No?
it advanced it. You know,
Okay.
it did advance it. I mean, I was on a particular course before that, and I don't think the parrots altered that course so much as they brought me forward another step.
Mm-hmm.
And although it did open a lot of doors that I didn't have open to me before,
Yeah.
and
Too
that
many doors?
sometimes, yeah,
I just remember the part where you say you'd been living a bit like a hermit, and then one day you woke up and you were on the front page of the newspaper and you had
yeah.
reporters calling
Uh,
you, and you're going, "What's going on?"
and you were saying that you were hoping you would run into me somewhere. Well, you would,
Yes, I'm
because I
sure
was
that
on
happened to you.
airplanes. I was in
Yeah.
airplanes all over the country, in hotels, and you know, theater openings, and all these kinds of things at that time.
You had started out meditating, and
Mhm.
before all of this happened, you made three wishes for your life. And do you think that meditating helped you to kind of direct your life towards arriving at what you had wished for?
Yes. The thing is, what I think happens with I mean, like well, I was reading something recently about the way. People think about the way as sort of like a path you travel, but this guy was saying, and I think it was Huang Po. He says it's not, the way is not a path. It's just your life is inside of you.
Mm-hmm.
And so the closer you come to who you really are, the better your choices are going to be. And you're going to make the choices that sort of like you're this tree with a lot of roots,
Mm-hmm.
and you follow them out. And if you get off course, then you're not going to have the experiences you should. But I was extremely centered for a while. I mean, I'm less so right now because of a lot of different work I'm doing, and I'm trying to get back to that centeredness. But you know, work will sort of take you away from, you know, just sort of the stillness that you have when you just sit.
Yeah, and it's almost as if the time that you spent on the streets gave you a chance. You were really pretty stubborn in living by your own rules and your own vision for yourself and who you were wanting to be at the time. I think that's the impression that I got.
I
And
was
but
actually not stubborn. I was
no.
terrified. I was
Oh,
terrified to do anything else. I
okay.
felt like if I didn't do that, I was going to lose myself.
Okay.
Just as an aside, I'm writing a book right now called Street Song, which is about that period, and I'll
Oh,
make very
okay.
clear what I was doing then.
And I also there it just seems like your life was a bit touched by magic because the day that you had an encounter where you were living in a van, and you finally had to make the decision, or it was made for you that you had to go away and you couldn't live there anymore,
Yeah.
you walked to Washington Square Park in a state of panic.
Yeah.
And don't
Yeah.
you live right there now?
I'm still in the same neighborhood. Yeah, that's very
Yeah,
ironic to me in some ways. I mean,
yeah.
it's just over the hill. I'm on Telegraph Hill now. I'm on the east side of the hill, and North Beach is on the west side of the hill.
Okay.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I can still walk by certain buildings and remember horrible things that happened to me on
Yeah.
the street around that time. You know, and
Mm-hmm.
that, like, there's one church staircase that where I was really just sort of at my wit's end, and when I see that, I still remember that day.
Yeah.
It was a tough time. It was very, very, very hard.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it didn't hurt me anything. You know, I learned a lot from it.
Yeah.
As anything that's really hard to do will. It'll
Mm-hmm.
teach
So what were the three wishes that you had made? And
you. You
where were
know,
you when you made the
I
three
don't
wishes?
remember
Don't
that
remember?
anymore. It's
Oh,
funny that I don't remember that. I mean, everything in that book was based on something real and
yeah.
true. But
Yeah.
I've
No, I
gotten away from
understand.
it because I'm in this different. I'm remembering a different period of my life now.
Totally. Yeah.
So I don't remember what you're talking about.
So you made three wishes.
Okay.
One of them, now let me see if I can remember. One of them I know was to find the love of your life.
Mhm.
One of them was to live in the country, but you kind of
Yeah,
found
yeah,
that in
yeah,
a
yeah,
way
yeah.
in the end. And I can't
I'm in a
remember.
garden now.
Yeah,
That's similar.
yeah, and I can't remember the first one actually, but
Okay, I don't
we'll find
remember.
out.
I think it was
Um,
work
Probably.
I believed in, because I
Yeah.
didn't have anything that I was doing that I really believed in work-wise.
Mm-hmm.
I was barely working, and that's
Yeah.
why I had the time to work with the parrots so much, be with the parrots.
Yeah.
But that, you know, writing the book and learning how filmmaking works and all of that has supported me ever since.
Yeah.
But
And
it's ad hoc. It's not. There's
yeah.
not a real job there.
Yeah. Well, you're being true to who you are. And so your relationship with the parrots, I'm sure that I won't get away with not talking about that a little bit more
Right.
um,
Okay.
for the audience. So you probably had such a unique experience, one that I don't think very many people, if any, could say that they've had. Um, in in befriending wild parrots. A lot of people who were walking by your home at the time you lived on Telegraph Hill assumed that you owned the parrots, right?
Yeah, some did, yeah. Because
Mm,
they couldn't imagine why else would these parrots be here. It was the same question I had.
right.
They
And
must be somebody's pets. I thought maybe somebody owned these birds and was letting them fly around all day long, and then they'd come home at the end of the day or something like
mm,
that.
and could you describe Telegraph Hill for people who have no idea what it is in San Francisco?
Telegraph Hill's in the very northeast corner of the peninsula that the city is on, and it's really right the heart of the place. When you think of San Francisco, you think of Chinatown and Fisherman's Wharf and North Beach and the downtown, and Telegraph Hill is around all of those places.
Mm.
Uh,
And it is almost like you're not in the wilderness, but there is a very
there's a
garden.
wildness, yeah.
Yes.
A lot of the area here is too steep for roads. So for a long time, it was just scrub and sand. And
Mm,
then in the 40s, these two women started planting gardens all over the hill.
mm,
Not all over the hill, but in some places. And
yeah.
so where I live now is really just the center of a big garden because there can't be a road. All there is a staircase.
Yeah. And so you were living there in the 80s and 90s, was it that?
The
The,
Telegraph Hill?
yeah.
Yeah, I moved to Telegraph Hill in 88, I think. Yeah.
Okay. And you just looked out your window and started to see these parrots. And at first it was just a wild flock to you that intrigued you. And then little by little you started to see them as individuals and even gave them names, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And reading the book, they're like characters in a movie. You get
Yeah.
attached
Well,
to seeing their story unfold.
yeah. Well, the thing that I always say to people, like, I wouldn't say that I have a general interest in parrots specifically. A lot of people assume that I'm kind of a parrot person, and in a sense, I'm not. What happened is that there was this community of individuals who happened to be parrots, and I
Right.
got to know them, and they were my friends, and I loved them, and I would mourn their deaths. I would just feel devastated when one of them died, and I got to see their relationships, and they'd get mad at me, I'd get mad at them, and all of that stuff, you know. And
Yeah.
it was the thing about them that's different than human beings is that they don't play head games with you. They're just who they are, and they're
Right.
pretty upfront about it.
Which is comforting, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so there was a big theme of trust that, and yeah, be, they did trust you, but they were wary of you at first.
Yeah, well, like that's how trust works anyway.
Right.
There's this gradual overcoming of the wariness. There were certain things they wouldn't allow me to do because they don't want a hand on their back, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I never tried to reach around and pet them or like that. But they let me like joust with their beaks and stuff. I mean, that would
Yeah.
be a game to them, and that was okay. I had to be a little bit cool because, you know, there's things that make them nervous.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that I was always saying was that I had to be trustworthy. And
Yeah.
what did that mean? I had to be over and over and over and over again trustworthy and never break that.
Right. You were so careful. I loved how careful you were because so many people aren't.
Well, they forced me to be.
Yeah.
One thing that was really interesting, see, I forget a lot of this stuff, but as we're talking, it's coming back. When I was out among them, it's like there's all this wild energy that they put out. It's just wild and it's really intense, and you're being exposed to it. And it's not just an idea, it's actual energy.
Mm.
And so I'd be sitting or standing out there with them, and I would just feel the roar of because they're really high charge. They're just moving fast all day long. They're really speedy.
Yeah.
They do calm down at times, but it's a constant struggle to survive. So I'd be out, you know, in that energy, and it really wakes you up. It really makes you think about what's going on in front of you.
Yeah. And so how long did you know them personally?
6 years.
6 years. Okay.
Yeah.
How long do they live?
6 years. Well, it depends. In the wild, 12 is old. In captivity, 35 can be old.
Oh, wow. Okay.
They don't have access to vets out in the wild. There's more diseases. There's, you know, birds that prey on them.
Yeah. They don't have
accidents.
They don't have you in the wild.
Yeah.
You were kind of the perfect you know, middleman for being in the wild with a little help. Because you were keeping such a good eye on them that you did notice the times when they might have not survived had they not had someone like you. And those were the only times that you were willing to actually say they could come inside, right?
Yeah, I only took them in because they were ill or something. Generally speaking, though, I saw over the long run that if a bird was sick enough that I had to bring it in, it didn't last long after I released it. They were not. I don't know how big of a difference I made. There was one bird that I saved that was a mitered conure. She was a different species than the rest of the flock. And to this day, there are a lot of hybrids in the flock because she mated with the cherry heads. She was a mitered conure mating with cherry heads. So you have all these hybrids, and the hybrids were fertile, and they were mating with other hybrids and other cherry heads. And I probably had an influence that way because I did save her life, and she stuck around for a while. Good many years, actually.
And you even at one point orchestrated a romance for Connor, who who lost his mate.
Yeah. I loved him.
Yeah. And the readers do too. I think when we read the story, we fall in love with all of them. Yeah.
Well, in the movie, I mean, you see his face, and he has a really regal face.
Yeah, you describe him as regal And you get into that, you get into how you were worried about anthropomorphizing them at first,
Yeah.
and especially when you spoke to a scientist,
Yeah.
the curator of birds at the San Francisco City Zoo,
Yeah.
right? He
Johnny.
came to visit you
Yeah.
because you started to attract attention and people started to know that you were serious about what you were doing. And he came to visit you and you started to get a bit self-conscious and worried that he was thinking of things in a scientific way, whereas you're not a scientist and you're kind of doing things your own way. And as he left, you said something, it sounded like you mumbled something to him about, I'm sorry, I'm anthropomorphizing, and he didn't have a problem with it.
Yeah.
And I just, I do find it interesting because at the end you come back to that and say that you actually don't have a problem either with what you did with them, because you do see them as individuals in the end.
Well, part of the problem is that when the idea that you're anthropomorphizing an animal means that we have a certain kind of consciousness and the animals don't.
Right.
But there's a universality
Mhm.
that's neither human nor animal, so to speak. It's just consciousness.
Right.
So if you're noticing something in an animal that's like a human being,
Mhm.
what you're noticing is just that common aspect of personality that's in all creatures. Or maybe some creatures have more, a stronger proclivity for certain ways.
Characteristics.
Others.
Yeah.
Yeah, characteristics. But, it's not like we're the ones that and everything else is just sort of, floating around and they're random,
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I think anybody who's had a relationship with a dog or a cat, those are the most relatable.
Yeah.
Would
I
attest.
get that stuff all the time. Just as an example,
Yeah.
we have 2 birds from the flock living with us here that are both rescues. They can't be released.
Mhm.
And they love to come to the bed, but they're in another room. So I can walk into their room just to say hello to them, and they know I'm not bringing them to the bed. I can walk in with the intention of bringing them to the bed, and they get excited. They know they're going to the bed.
Really?
And I work real hard to not just to test it, to
Yeah.
show my intention. They still get it every time. They know
That's
when
incredible.
I'm bringing them to the bed.
Yeah, that's incredible.
There's this famous thing about a guy who trained a horse to count, and then they realized that the guy was giving them cues. I think it was Hans. There's some kind of syndrome they talk about. But, I don't think I'm doing that. I don't think I'm giving them any cues. So it's not like that. They just get it. There's all kinds of things they understand. They understand words. They know what certain words mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it sounds like within the flock, they have ways of being social with each other.
Yeah. They're extremely social.
Yeah, and like there was the one story of Sonny, who you would call after Sonny the Godfather, because he was a bully, and he got kicked out for a few days or some kind of period of time from the flock, as if he was being punished for bad behavior. There are moments that are just so relatable. There's the moment when Connor got mad at you and chastised you for caging one of the parrots who needed help. It was I forget which parrot it was.
That's a story that escapes me, but I've had several things like that. I got chewed out by a blue jay once, scrub jay, because I had the door to the apartment open, and one of the birds that I was taking care of, who was sick, was starting to run out the door. So I ran and grabbed him, and the scrub jay watched me do that and started chewing me out for it.
Yeah, that actually happened to my brother and I when we had cleared out my mom's backyard, where we were living next to a next door neighbor with a lot of bamboo that had been covered with vines, and it was making its way into our yard, which the animals loved because they could just scurry across that vine and jump up on the bamboo. And one day we kind of cut off that connection for them, and a squirrel who had obviously gone in the morning over to the bamboo and wanted to come back came back on his usual route, and he looked at us and he knew there was just this knowing. He knew we were the ones who had done it. I don't
Yeah.
know if we still had something in our hands or what, but he looked at us, and I'm telling you, he was doing this with his fist, and he was going
Yeah.
it was amazing. We looked at each other just going, oh my God, he's communicating how angry he is
Where
at
was
us.
that? Was that in East Bend?
Berkeley. Mhm.
I never see squirrels here in San Francisco, at least not in this part of town. But during the time that I was feeding the parrots, a squirrel showed up here in the gardens, and he became a regular part of the parrot community because he liked the seeds too, and the ball, and he would eat with them.
Yeah. And you didn't get very much trouble from the neighbors, because sometimes people who feed birds.
I got some. I didn't get none.
Okay.
But it wasn't too bad. Most people were, charmed by it. It was like, there's this beautiful, massive garden with steps running through it, and I remember several times I'd be sitting out on my front porch after finishing a feeding, and the birds were still in the area. I'd be playing my guitar, and these people who don't know the area, they're already surprised to see this garden. And here's some strange guy sitting on his porch playing the guitar while there were all these parrots around him. And so that's kind of a magic scene. You see something like that, you wonder, well, San Francisco is a strange place, isn't it?
Yeah.
Different.
Yeah. You said you didn't want to be seen as an eccentric.
No, because I'm not, for one thing. And,
of course not.
But, you get a reputation. Bird people have,
Of course, yeah.
Yes. It's classic.
It is. But it was sentimental for you, and that comes out in the movie too. We see how there's a real affection between you and the birds. It's not a one-way connection.
Yeah.
And so you must have strong feelings about captivity and pet ownership when it comes to parrots.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Well, it's not doctrinaire in the sense that I don't believe, there is a bird trade, and I'm not really wild about that bird trade, but some people want to release their pet birds into the flock, and I always tell them, no, that's a big mistake, because all the birds that formed this flock were originally wild caught and brought up here. They were wild in the first place. Pet birds are not going to make it. They haven't had, a baby will be with its parents for a year before they turn it loose.
Yeah, wow.
So there's a lot of learning that goes on.
Right.
So I'm not in favor of turning birds loose because they die.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't like the idea of, caging something up and making it your pet.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of problems with birds being kept in captivity, and then the people don't get tired of them. They don't want them anymore. And there are all these little volunteer groups that take care of these birds and try to find homes for them, but it's a real problem. So, I don't have one position on it.
Okay.
And whatever is best for the individual bird.
Yeah.
Depending on how it got to where it is. But I'm not in favor of the burgeoning pet trade. No.
And when you had Dogen, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes. Yeah.
When you had Dogen at your house, you were having problems with her biting, and you saw that some pet owners suggested being very strict and punishing the bad behavior and then really praising the good behavior. And so you decided to do that. And then at the end, you said, actually, that was something that it did work, but you said that you didn't need to do it because you think she would have caught on.
I'm certain.
Yeah.
She was my best friend after all is said and done in the flock.
Oh, wow.
She used to come in and visit me after I released her. She was with me for about a year. I don't remember how long now, but we got along really well. We loved each other.
So was it hard for you then to leave?
No, because we didn't. This was a bone of contention between Judy and me when we were making the film. I'd had enough. I didn't want to make it my whole life. I was ready to go, but I didn't, because I felt like I was supposed to do it. I couldn't choose an arbitrary time to do it. It had to have a natural ending. But I really wanted out because I had to move on with my life. That's not what I never felt like that's what I was intended to do all my
Mm,
life. There was something I needed to learn, and I did learn it. And they didn't need me.
yeah.
So, it's not like they were sad to see me go or anything like that. I was
Yeah.
quite happy to be done with it. But, I have a lot of, I mean, as we're talking, when you said Dogen, I don't think about Dogen very much these days. But as soon as you said Dogen, I felt,
Something.
yeah,
Yeah.
a little choked up.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, I have a few quotes. Maybe it'll help bring back some memories. This quote is just about you discovering the birds and how much happiness the whole discovery brought you. So it says, I felt like I had a box seat at the opera. I could see for miles and miles across the expanse of the bay to the rolling brown hills on the distant northern horizon. I learned to spot the parrots from the moment that they were just specks over Fisherman's Wharf a half-mile away. I could detect their squawking when it was just the faintest element in the great background of urban clamor. As the days passed, the parrots and I became increasingly casual with one another. I remember one time when Marlin had his back to me and was staring down at something in the garden. It was his turn for a seed, so I tapped him lightly on the wing, something I'd never done. Marlin turned around, took the seed, and then looked away again. A moment like that would satisfy me for days.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah. And then there's another one. You're speaking about Dogen. You say, I knew I was going to miss her. We'd become close. We had a ritual that she expected every evening after dinner. She'd wait for me to lie down on the couch, and then she'd climb up on my chest for a long evening of petting. She'd shut her eyes and lay her cheek on my chest as I stroked her body and scratched her neck. On the few occasions that I had visitors, they usually expressed surprise that a bird could be so affectionate. Most of them thought of birds as remote, unfeeling creatures. Yeah.
It's funny. I forget so much of this. I haven't read the book in a long, long time. I should read it again now, but
Maybe, yeah. Maybe it's
yeah, but
time.
it's just like, oh yes, I remember all of that, and it
Mhm.
was when I was first doing it, I think the first 3 years were entirely magical to me.
Yeah.
But I was alone all the time, and the birds were my only friends, in fact.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I started yearning for human contact again.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I
but
had to
those
laugh.
first 3 years, especially the first year, but the first 3 years were really. I had permission to stay where I was staying the first 3 years. The last 3 years, I was squatting, I was
Mhm.
hiding, and there was
Mhm.
somebody helping me stay where I was. So that became more urgent. I
Stressful.
wanted it. Yeah, I wanted to
Yeah.
find a more secure place.
Yeah, I I laughed when you had a moment that was affectionate with the parrot and you ended it with, I needed a girlfriend.
Yeah, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I did.
Yeah. And also there is something that you mentioned, speaking of going back to the telepathic sort of consciousness stuff. You know, there's that moment with humans. If you're on, like in Paris, for example, if I'm on the metro, and my back is turned to someone, but their eyes are piercing me.
Yeah, yeah.
If I look behind, I can sense that they're looking at me. And you experienced that with Connor.
Yes. In fact, I was thinking about that last night. I figured that I would tell you that story if it became germane, but you're telling me, so
Yes,
that
I would
yeah.
love to hear that story.
Okay, I was
Yeah.
working at my desk and I felt somebody staring at me, and I turned around and Connor was in a bush all by himself trying to get my attention.
Hmm.
So that was the telepathy that you were just mentioning. That,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's foolish to ignore it. A lot of people will deny it. They'll say, "Oh, you're blah, 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 blah." But
Yeah.
that was real. I felt it, and
Yeah.
we feel it with human beings all the time too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's the vibes, the
Yeah,
vibration.
yeah,
Yeah. But it's we lack the vocabulary or scientific acknowledgement of it in a way. So it's tough to take ourselves seriously.
yeah,
And yeah, we ignore it. Like that happens. That has happened to me so many times. And because it lacks that vocabulary or that knowledge around it.
Well, we also have a system now that is set up to deny it. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we're supposed to not believe in it. That
Yeah.
if you're a mature person, you'll just know that it's some kind of coincidence. But I
Right.
think that's where we're really lacking. Our current understanding of how the mind works shortchanges how the mind actually works. I was thinking of this story at the end of one of the shows that I attended,
Yeah.
movie theaters. I introduced the film, etc. And afterwards, this guy came up to me and he said he wanted to pull me off to the side and talk to me, tell me something had happened to him once. He was walking through a forest, and this bird started following him and speaking to him. He felt, but he didn't believe in that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it bugged him. And he didn't know what to think of it. And he'd never told anybody about it. But he had this certainty that the bird was trying to communicate to him somehow. And he wanted to know whether I thought that was possible. And I said, oh, yes, I do. I wouldn't know why the bird was trying to do it, but it sure is possible. But the interesting thing to me, the reason I'm telling you, is that his own, was so weird to me, and I've never told anybody. I don't know what to think of it. What do you say? You know,
Like
so
it's a
I mean,
secret. Like
yeah,
it's
like it was
so
a secret.
taboo. I'm only telling you.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder how many people have those interactions. And so many of us are deprived of those interactions. That's what I think is so special about your story, is that I think so many of us, our lives would be so much more heartfelt and full of love. Maybe I don't know what words I'm looking for, but
Connection.
yes, a connection. Our lives would be so much more full of connection, which so many people are lacking, if we were able to create these relationships. And so
Or
I think a lot of
they're,
people are
you know,
jealous
they're
of you.
there. They're there. I mean, it's just that we ignore them, or we sort of paper them over or something. It's just like, it seems too weird. I don't know what to think about it.
Yeah. And so part of your experience was journaling what you were observing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Did you have discussions with scientists about what you were observing at any point?
Not very little, actually, because it's a job,
Yeah.
being a scientist, and you want to keep your reputation intact. And I was a
Right.
little bit controversial.
I just wonder if you observe certain things that aren't seen usually, you know?
Yes, and I did get some acknowledgement
Mm-hmm.
later, but while I was doing it, they didn't want to have much to do with me. There was one interesting thing, though. Fort Mason, it's part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, and that's where some of the nests used to be. And I wanted to see inside of a nest. And I just have a high school degree. That's it. I don't have any credentials at all. But I wrote to the GGNRA and I asked if they could put me. They're way up high in these palm trees, and they got me up there. And I just thought it was sweet that I had no, credentials.
Yeah.
But they were willing to give me that opportunity to look inside a nest, to put me up in this contraption.
Yeah. And so how did it come about that you wrote the book? At what point did you start writing the book?
Probably about 3 years into the experience. I'd been keeping records, but I was really frustrated with I was just doing odd jobs. I wasn't doing anything that really utilized anything that I liked to do. And I've always liked to write. And so I was so frustrated that I said, okay, I've got to make some money doing something that I actually like. And well, I know I could write an article about the parrots. So I wrote an article about the parrots, submitted it to a magazine, and they bought it. I thought, oh, this is easy. Not, but that gave me the impetus to try to write something longer. So I started working on the book then, and I got it published.
In the midst of writing the book, did Judy show up at your door?
Yes, I was already working on the book. She was, out of the 6-year experience, she was there for the last year.
Okay. And so she was one of the 3 wishes.
Yeah.
She ended up being your love.
We had one friend in common, it turned out, one
Okay.
person that knew both of us. And she was in the neighborhood a lot because she was a member of the South End Rowing Club. They swim in the bay very near where I live. So we
Okay.
probably had a lot of encounters, but we never got to know each other until she read about me. In fact, she read that article I wrote for that bird magazine that I told you about.
Okay. But
And that
she wasn't convinced, right? At first.
at first she thought I was kind of strange and that I was probably pretty inarticulate. And
No,
so we
not
wanted to
even,
make a children's film,
yes.
and that I would just sort of be this quiet thing feeding birds while these children interacted. But it didn't work out. And I was okay. What happened is I was telling the children stories during breaks in the filming, and then
Mm.
she realized that I knew how to talk. So the thing shifted from children to me.
Yeah.
But originally, it was going to be a children's, a fiction film.
And it's a good thing that it turned into the film that it was.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, and do you have any favorite stories that you'd like to share of the parrots?
Dogan is my favorite story because when I started it, I had this sort of little boy's fantasy of having a parrot friend, one that would come in to the house and visit and then go back out to the flock. Well, that wasn't going to happen with any bird in the flock, but because Dogan was seriously ill, I had to bring her in. And she ended up being that in the sense that once she was ready to be released, she was so used to being with me that she would, come into the house, see what I
Yeah.
was eating, hang out for a while. If it was going to rain, she spent the night sometimes because she
Oh,
didn't
how
want to be out in
cute.
the rain. Yeah. So she's my favorite story because she turned out to be sort of what my dream was to have a parrot friend,
Mm-hmm.
one who trusted me and who would also be a wild bird.
Yeah, what an amazing moment. Were you ever worried about their future?
Yes, I've been several times. I mean, I still, even though I don't have anything to do with the flock on a
Mm-hmm.
day-to-day basis, I'm always on the alert for problems. I had a big problem after this all ended where there was a group of people feeding the birds in a park downtown, and the birds were getting too tame, and some of them were getting grabbed by the feeders. And I had to do this very strange thing of going to the city and asking them for a law to stop this feeding. And it became a huge, thing. What a hypocrite he is. And it was
Yeah.
New York Times covered it, and they were
Oh
bad mouthing the New
no.
York Times. But it was just like, if that book and the film created a situation that was bad for the parrots where they were losing their freedom, then that was my responsibility, and I felt really bad about it. So I went to war, and I didn't care if I got considered a hypocrite or anything, because I was not about to let those birds be turned into, for one thing, sort of a tourist attraction that was really
Mm-hmm.
ugly to me, and then secondly, lose their freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And the sort of the leader of that whole feeding movement, the guy I at least had to go toe to toe with, I ran into him years later, and he said, "Yeah, you were right." So he said we were wrong, and I liked
Yeah,
that. I appreciated that.
that's good. So you lived in Seattle and then you moved to Berkeley, right? And
Yeah,
then you lived in San Francisco.
yeah.
Oh,
I
and
was a street singer in Berkeley.
you were a what?
Street singer in Berkeley.
Oh, okay.
That's a lot of what my book that I'm working on now is about. It's called
So
Street Song.
we may have run into each other back then.
Awesome.
So I called you a Dharma bum in the beginning in your introduction. Could you explain a little bit for people who don't know what that is?
Yeah, there's a tradition in certain religious cultures of the homeless wanderer,
Mm-hmm.
and the person who's on a spiritual search and doesn't have a home.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody who doesn't have a home in America we'll often call a bum.
Mm-hmm.
And the poet Gary Snyder, who is into Buddhism, came up with this term Dharma bum, Dharma being a Sanskrit term for truth, you could say. It's really controversial about what you could call Dharma. But a Dharma bum would be a seeker of truth, somebody who's looking for truth but without a home. He's just
Mhm.
wandering from place to place. And it wasn't like I said, oh, that's a cool idea, I want to be one of those. It wasn't like that at all, but that's what I ended up doing
Mhm.
because of some other things. I was just on a course. When I was 14, I got really upset with conventional life. It was a crisis for me. I just couldn't stand the way I was living. I felt like I was wasting every moment of my life. I was doing nothing. So I made a vow that I was going to find the right way to live. But what was the right way to live? I didn't know, and I just went through all of these different ideas. And one of them was that when I was about 19 or 20, I came across this idea through several different people, one of them being the writer Henry Miller, that you needed to go to the street,
Mhm.
and that when you lost everything, and the Bob Dylan song Like a Rolling Stone has the same idea in it, when you lose everything, then you see what's real.
Mhm.
It's not quite like that, but that's the direction I thought that was what it was. So I
Yeah.
was afraid to do it, but I went after it, and I ended up on the street. And I
Yeah.
not like I wanted to,
No. But
but
you
I had
but
some
brought
problem.
it brought you there. You say you had a romantic idea,
Yes,
that
exactly.
there was an idea of living in squalor as a path
Yeah.
to becoming a visionary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you
Yeah.
know who Arthur Rimbaud is?
You
The
mentioned
poet.
him. Yeah,
French
yeah.
poet. Yeah, and he was sort of the father of the idea,
Mm,
and he really lived it, but it ruined him to a degree.
mm. Yeah, so you didn't actually want that.
I
Um,
wanted health. I wanted to be bright and alive and clear.
mhm.
And it wasn't really that I was seeking squalor, but I just thought I was seeking sort of a minimal amount of
Right.
distractions to see what was real. And you test your nerve against it. But you don't know what it is before you go there. And I did end up on the street, and like I got to see what it was,
Mhm.
and I knew I didn't want to stay there. But you know, we have to find a way to make our lives more alive without having to just sell our souls, or living in squalor. I mean, it's sort of like there's either or. You're either homeless or you're wealthy enough to survive the
Mhm.
cost of living. And that's not working. And I think we need to find a way that's sort of down the middle.
And it's not the essence of life, right?
It's not the essence of
Yeah.
life. Yeah.
Um, yeah, and the parrots seemed like they brought you to that feeling, that awakened state.
I would say what they did more than anything else is taught me that just to consider human beings as the end all and be all of existence is a big mistake.
Mhm.
And now I realize that consciousness, the mind, whatever, is much, much larger than that. And that's what they did for me more than anything.
Mhm.
It's not all they did, but I mean, it taught me about trust. You trust me. People say that all the time,
Yeah.
but it doesn't mean anything. What trust is built on being trustworthy and doing it over and over and over again,
Mm.
never betraying it. And that's what I had to do with them if I wanted to get close to them.
Yeah, and um so you've thought a lot about consciousness before and since.
Yeah.
And so now do you walk around your life, do you live your life in a different way thinking about all these creatures that are around us and their
Yeah,
lives that
sure.
they're living? Yeah.
Yes. I always see it. For instance, I never noticed. I mean, it's not that I dismissed animals. I didn't. I always liked animals, but I didn't pay close attention to them. Or if I did, it was because I made an effort. But I don't have to make that effort anymore. I see them. I just see them. There are birds all around us, for example. We
Hmm.
have coyotes in our backyard sometimes, and raccoons come to visit. And so I just see all of that stuff now, and I recognize them not as vermin
Hmm.
or dangerous or any of that. They're just living their lives.
Yeah, because you became so in tune, really, with the lives that these parrots were living away from you, even.
Yeah,
You were paying attention to where they were going to roost, and then who wasn't coming back, and what might have happened to them, who
yeah,
was injured. Um,
it became this maniacal curiosity. I just
Yeah.
wanted to know everything. I
Yeah.
was reading books about parrots. I was studying them. By keeping a journal, I started noticing certain patterns too. So all of that stuff became very useful.
Hmm. Well, it's fascinating. I wished that I could have had that experience, but I'll keep myself from befriending the parrots in the park here.
You'll have your own experience, whatever
Yeah,
it is.
yeah. And what do you think about the idea of manifesting? You know, people say manifesting,
Yes.
like the idea of believing that you create your future, because it almost sounds like you did.
Well, I'm of two minds about that because I think part of what you manifest is what's already there. I think that it's like you have the stuff inside of you, and to manifest it just means to bring it to. It's not like you go over here to grab something and manifest that. The only thing you should really be manifesting is what's really inside of you. It's
Hmm.
just that we don't know much of that stuff because we're living on the surface so much.
Hmm. So do you feel like the parrots brought you to a place where you knew yourself on a deeper level?
To some degree, but I mean, I still have a ways to go. You know, it was one experience, and
Hmm.
I went deep into it. And you know, it's like I'm writing this book, Street Song. I would have never gotten away with writing this book except for the Wild Parrot books.
I think that's
So
true.
all of
Yeah.
these things, you know, the book I'm working on now is the book I've always wanted to write
Hmm.
because it was a really unusual experience. It was that time on the street,
Hmm.
what took me there and what it was like being there. But I would have never had the credentials, so to speak,
Hmm.
to write a book like that,
Right.
except
No
for
one
Wild
would have given
Parrot.
you the time of day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the Parrot book was a New York Times bestseller, so I can walk around with that as sort of one of
That
my
is so
credentials.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Congratulations on that. Yeah.
Thank
Um, yeah, and how people probably treated you on the streets.
you.
Probably
Well, yeah, it's
a little
funny
tough.
because I was always really anonymous and in the neighborhood. Nobody knew me. I kept to myself, and I walked around the neighborhood with nobody paying any attention to me. And
Hmm.
then the movie became a big deal. And I was still living the same way because I don't feel any different inside, but some people thought I was being aloof.
Hmm.
Oh,
Yeah.
they're, you know, in this movie. And it wasn't like that at all. It's just I didn't know how to be any different in the neighborhood among the people that I'd always been seeing for decades, you know. I
Yeah.
didn't know them, they didn't know me. I was just a face.
That must have
You
been
know,
a strange phenomenon.
well, I I still encounter it. It's really strange. People think that if your face has been in a movie, then you're famous. And if you're famous, you're rich. And none of that is true, you know?
Yeah.
And so I'm not rich.
Hmm.
And so, but I have to deal with this idea people have that wealth and fame or any kind of, you know, notoriety go hand in hand, and they don't, you know.
Hmm. Yeah. Would you say people still recognize you on the streets in San Francisco?
Yeah, in the neighborhood they do, but unless they've already, I'm older now. I mean, that film was 20 years ago, so fewer and fewer people will recognize me now.
Mm,
But it does happen occasionally, yeah.
yeah. And you're representative sort of the spirit of the Bay Area, and the older spirit of the Bay Area,
Yeah,
which it's kind of lost now.
that's
Um, yeah, the you talked about it changing from the beats to the hippies to the yuppies, and now the whole tech world has taken over.
yeah. And the
I'm
people
glad.
that live here in North Beach now have no idea that it was ever what it was. It, so that's kind of, I mean, people don't know the past generally anymore, but I did a lot of research on what the neighborhood was. And
Hmm.
I mean, seeing people all day long, they have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, thank
All
you.
right. Take care.
You too.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.